Hey guys, it's Villain Theory, and today I'm comparing Marvel Champions the card game to Arkham Horror the card game. Most people know me for Marvel Champions, I've got over 100 videos for it on my channel, but people might be surprised to hear I have just as many expansions for Arkham Horror as I do for Marvel Champions. I really enjoy both of them. They are both made by the same company, Fantasy Flight Games. They share a lot of systems and sort of the way they work, but they're also extremely different games. Before we get into it, this video is actually sponsored. It's brought to you by Chaos Cards, who've sponsored the channel before. I've used them for years, long before they sponsored me, and I only have a good thing to say about them. If you go onto their website, chaoscards.co.uk, and use discount code VillainChaos at the checkout, you get £3 off when you spend £30 or more. And I believe that will convert to, euros or whatever currency you use, dollars. Do, of course, check the postage, mailing charge if you are not from the UK. One use per customer, excludes pre-orders and damaged items, expires end of February, so you don't have long to use it. Get on there now, and in my opinion, it's just a great website for any board game stuff, card game stuff, Arkham, Marvel, Star Wars Unlimited, Magic the Gathering. They've got a bunch of stuff, Lorcana. I saw somebody actually use the discount code before just for sleeves. They're like, oh, I play a lot of card games. I'm just gonna, order £30 worth of Dragon Ship sleeves, get £3 off. Great deal. So thank you to Chaos Cards for sponsoring this video. They actually provided me a copy of Arkham Horror, the Winter Gala scenario pack. It has gone out of stock like a lot of stuff for Marvel Champions and Arkham Horror have lately after the Fireside chat. So I'm not going to focus on that one scenario pack too much in this video as I originally planned to, but it was very, very fun. So huge thank you to Chaos Cards. So if you're wondering which game to get, we're going to cover that here. But if you're just curious to hear comparisons between how different parts work, in terms of the design and, how similar but different they are, we're also going to be covering that here. And I'm going to save you guys some time. If you really like superheroes, you should probably just get Marvel Champions. If you really like sort of supernatural horror mystery, Arkham Horror is going to be the game for you. If you like to play solo, Marvel Champions is a lot more solo friendly than Arkham Horror. But if you play multiplayer, they are both excellent experiences. Marvel Champions is kind of a boss battler, so there'll always be a villain out on the board, and every round he's going to be like attacking you. Whereas in Arkham Horror, sometimes there's just no enemies out. You're moving around, there are locations on the board in Arkham Horror, whereas Marvel Champions, there's nothing to represent a map of any kind. But in Arkham Horror, you are moving around this map. It kind of has board game elements as well as card game elements, and even some role-playing kind of game elements. There's kind of a simulated dice kind of... there's a bag of tokens, and you reach in and you randomly pick out a token, and depending on the number on it, it will help you or, hinder you toward your goal. Whereas Marvel Champions doesn't have anything quite like that. Marvel Champions, you play a card, it does what it says. In Arkham Horror, you play a card, you're attempting something, and you better hope you succeed because, the horror in Arkham Horror is certainly present. There's a tension in that game. You are, bad things can happen even from your own deck, rarely. You have to stay on your toes. Things are going to go wrong. It is the nature of a horror-focused game. If you like to win a lot, Marvel Champions is probably going to be the game for you. If you like to have a very solid chance of failure and having to work around things going wrong, Arkham Horror is probably going to be more of the fun experience for you. Marvel Champions does kind of have some story to it, but it is very much just you go and fight the villain, but in most cases, maybe with some little story kind of dancing around it, but really, you're just punching the bad guy. Arkham Horror is very story-based. Each time you play a scenario, there are generally different outcomes, which will have sort of an effect on the next scenario you play, but that is kind of the cost of this. In Arkham Horror, typically it's played in campaigns, which consist typically of 8 scenarios, whereas Marvel Champions, there are campaigns, especially, in the big expansion boxes beyond the core set, but typically most people play that game, standalone scenarios. You pick a villain and you fight them. You don't have to fight a bunch in a row, etc., etc., unless you particularly choose to. But Arkham Horror, if you choose not to do it, the campaign format, you lose out on quite a lot. Arkham Horror wants you to play through an evolving story where your choices from one scenario kind of pass on to the next scenario. You gain XP and you can kind of keep upgrading your deck, whereas in Marvel Champions, the deck is pretty static, even in the campaigns. All in all, Arkham, with its map system, its campaign, the experience, it just asks a lot more from the player. Also, the chance of failure, you're trying to manage that. It's not just playing the right cards, but it's trying to succeed at what they do, which you can influence and so on and so forth. It asks for more than Marvel Champions, but the systems are a little bit deeper. It has more levers to pull, more things going on. So if you're really happy to get into a very complicated game, Arkham Horror, I don't think is, extraordinarily complicated in the grand scheme of board games, but it's definitely, not an entry-level game. Marvel Champions is definitely, I would say, friendlier to a new player. Generally takes a bit less brain power, generally an easier game. although it can be very difficult and have its difficult moments. So, don't underestimate it, especially if you've not played this kind of game before. But one of the reasons I love Marvel Champions so much, it's just so easy to play. I've got my hero, I've got their deck, I've got the villain, they've got their deck, slap them on the table, and you can fight. Arkham Horror, I'm committing to a campaign. I have to set up the map for that campaign. Different locations connect to different locations. And if I want to then play another game of Arkham Horror, I'm generally continuing that campaign. Whereas Marvel Champions, throw down whatever I want, and off we go. That easy. Deck building was also a big factor, I think. In Marvel Champions, when you pick a hero to play, they come with 15 cards that are mandatory to include in that deck. Effectively, they've built a big chunk of the deck for you. A lot of the burden of what you need to bring has already been kind of fulfilled by the game's design. Whereas in Arkham Horror, you're basically building the entire thing yourself. So Marvel Champions is a lot more forgiving for deck building. It's a lot easier. They come with sort of pre-constructed decks, and you can use those pretty effectively, even if they're not, the best. In Arkham Horror, however, the game really asks you to be a deck builder because as you progress through this campaign, you get more and more experience. You're going to have to spend it to upgrade the deck. Now, both of these games will have decks posted online, etc., etc. But the people making these decks aren't going to know how your campaign is going in Arkham Horror. They won't know how much experience you've got. They won't know what campaign you're doing. They won't know what kind of trials and things have left, scars on your character. You can get mental trauma, health trauma, things like that that might affect what you want to take. Arkham Horror, where you really have to build the entire deck, you build the entire engine, your entire game plan yourself, and then upgrade it. It just asks quite a bit more than Marvel Champions, which already, the deck building in Marvel Champions can go very deep already. So, both of these games have plenty of depth. I think if you want to build decks and you enjoy building decks, both games are going to be really, really fun. But Marvel Champions, you can kind of get away with a bit less, so it's a bit more forgiving. Whereas in Arkham Horror, you're gonna have to really put some effort into it. But it is really fun and incredibly rewarding if you like that kind of thing, which I absolutely love. We can look at the characters and we can see things work a little bit differently here. Spider-Man is from Marvel Champions. He's got 1 forwarding, 2 attack, 3 defense. Those are the numbers on the left of his card. Whereas Roland Banks has 4 numbers at the top right. 3 willpower, 3 intellect, 4 fight, and 2 agility. And Marvel Champions, you just take Spider-Man, you exhaust him, it's kind of like tapping from Magic. You just turn him on his side, say you're using him, and I choose the attack. Boom, he deals 2 damage because he's got 2 attack. Whereas in Arkham Horror, you have a set amount of actions per turn and different ways to trigger those actions. We'll use different stats. Sometimes the bad cards coming at you are going to ask you to use different stats to do different things. And having 4 in fight doesn't mean I'm going to do 4 damage, but it means I've got a better chance of dealing a 1 point of damage. A character with 1 fight and 4 fight deal the same amount of damage innately, unless you've played other cards. But the character with 4 fight is going to have a significantly better chance of actually having that damage happen and go through, because in Arkham, it's not guaranteed. In Marvel Champions, each character, each hero, like Spider-Man, comes with 15 cards specific to them that you have to use. So they have a lot more depth in that 15 other cards have been designed around that identity card specifically for that character. Whereas in Arkham, that isn't necessarily the case. But in Arkham, because you're not restricted to having to have 15 cards set into your deck for you, you have so much more freedom to build your game plan, and there's so many ways that do work with the characters. But we need to talk about deck building and how that works. So if we look at the back of Spider-Man's card, it's Peter Parker, and you can change between Peter Parker and Spider-Man during the game if you're mainly focused on the hero form, typically, Spider-Man. But on the back of Roland's card, he's an investigator from Arkham Horror. He tells you all about his deck building, and this is where it gets a bit more complicated. In Marvel Champions, you basically have 4 classes of card, 4 aspects: aggression, protection, justice, leadership. And aggression deals damage, protection prevents damage. Most of them are fairly straightforward. And if I choose to play Spider-Man, I can choose any one of those 4 classes, 4 aspects, and I can build a deck from any of them. So if I build an aggression deck, I'll use aggression cards, and my Spider-Man will be very punchy. In Arkham Horror, there are 5 classes, but characters cannot just choose to take any one they want. Each character belongs to one primarily, and can often take cards from a second or sometimes even a third one, and so on. So Roland Banks is a Guardian. That's what the kind of blue coloration and the kind of badge with a star on it means on his card there. And he can take Guardian cards levels 0 to 5. But he can also take Seeker cards levels 0 to 2, which the closest comparison I have for Marvel Champions to any of my regular, watchers and listeners, it's kind of like saying your character can take aggression cards of any cost, but also justice cards up to 2 cost. Not exactly the same. So while Roland can only be built kind of as a Guardian, you can also include Seeker cards, Whereas if I played Peter Parker in Aggression, I would not be able to have Justice cards. So in Marvel Champions, I can play a hero in one of 4 aspects and get 4 different experiences on that character. Not all characters suit every aspect equally well, but most of them do work in all of them, especially with a big card collection. Whereas in Arkham Horror, I unlocked kind of what the back of the card is telling me. It's Guardian, this, Seeker, that, but they'll be extremely unique compared to the next character. Whereas, I could be playing Captain America in Marvel Champions, choose Aggression, and it's basically just what Peter Parker has access to, is what I've got access to. The classes in Marvel Champions are pretty straightforward. You've got Aggression, which does damage. That's the red card on the screen is from that aspect. Protection is green. It has Indomitable is one of the cards here on the screen, and that helps you prevent damage. Leadership is blue. That's all about using allies. And then Justice is yellow, and that's basically about kind of preventing the timer mechanic in Marvel Champions from going off. It basically helps you prevent the villain from completing their evil plan. Arkham Horror, on the other hand, has Guardian, which are the blue cards. We can see Machete here. That kind of is the equivalent to Aggression from Marvel Champions, but also Protection, because it kind of just deals with enemies and dealing damage, preventing damage. And Marvel Champions always has a villain out attacking you. It's kind of a boss battler. So having 2 different, classes to kind of handle damage makes sense. Whereas in Arkham Horror, there's not always an enemy out. So I think condensing kind of the real enemy-focused stuff into one class kind of makes sense. Then we've got Seeker, which is kind of comparable to Justice in Marvel Champions. Whereas Justice in Marvel Champions is trying to remove threat from the main scheme, trying to stop the villain complete their evil plan. In Arkham, the enemy's evil plan is inevitable, and you just have to get clues faster than them. So in Marvel, you're preventing the timer from going off. In Arkham, you're kind of racing the timer, and that is what Seeker is best at, finding clues. But then Arkham has Mystic, Rogue, and Survivor. These classes can kind of do a bit of everything, but they do it with very unique style. Mystic can kind of manipulate chaos tokens. It can kind of play around with Doom itself. It can make, be a little bit risky, and you can kind of push your luck to some degree. But then you've got Rogue, which can do all its own sneaky kind of tricks. But it's really about pushing your success as far as you can. It can reward you quite often if you succeed beyond what you need to. It's really fun. Doesn't start off that strong in the core set. I think Rogue in the core set, maybe not the best. Kind of like Protection in Marvel Champions in the core set, maybe not the best. But as the card collections grow, it becomes an incredibly strong, incredibly fun class. Lastly, in Arkham, you've got Survivor, which is kind of the everyday person. So, you've got fighters, investigators, magic users, and, really like sneaky like agents. Then you've just got survivors. They're just regular people. It could be, I don't know, a farmer, a hobo. It could be, a waitress. It's just anyone. And they are basically failing their way through, flailing maybe, muddling along. They get rewarded kind of for failure. When they fail something, they can get rewarded and benefits. So if they succeed, great. If they fail, they might still get something from it. It's a very unique play style. And if I had to rate these head to head, I gotta give it to Arkham. I just think Mystic, Rogue, and Survivor, so unique, so flexible. It's not about fulfilling sort of game roles such as dealing damage, finding clues, etc., etc. It's a really unique way to do all of those things, which is really, really fun. I do like Seeker and Guardian as well, but I feel like they're a lot plainer in comparison. So they're a really good starting point, and they are still really fun to this day. They just, you have to take the interesting cards in them to make them interesting, whereas I think Mystic, Rogue, and Survivor are innately interesting by design. In Marvel Champions, it's a lot simpler. Aggression does damage, protection prevents damage. It's pretty straightforward. I do like the classes though. I think all of them are fun. You can kind of extrapolate a lot of what we've been talking about to the deck building and the cards themselves. Whereas in Arkham Horror, there's just a few more complex things, a few more cards that talk to each other that have some really unique interactions, but you're going to have to work for it. Whereas in Marvel Champions, the cards are typically on average a bit simpler, but it's a lot easier to process, and you can play a lot more cards in one turn. So it's not really fair to compare them one to one. This is also probably a good time to say that in Marvel Champions, you draw a new hand of cards every turn, and every card is a resource. So Indomitable, as you can see on the screen here on the left, the green card, 1-cost upgrade. If I wanted to play this card, I would discard another card, 1 card, to meet that cost. In Arkham Horror, we can see Machete has a cost of 3 at the top left. That is paid for with resources, which are little tokens that represent money, a very typical board game thing. It's handled completely differently. So Arkham Horror, you're drawing 1 card at a time every turn, basically. For Marvel Champions, you get a new hand of cards every turn, and you are trying to play and spend them all each turn, every turn, going forward. So it's a lot faster paced, but you cannot, kind of manage your options turn to turn carefully. So in Arkham Horror, it's very much a case of being careful, using your resources thoughtfully, precisely. Whereas in Marvel Champions, it's a brawler, and you're trying to use everything you've got every turn to do as much as possible. I'm not going to go fully into depth on how all the scenarios work, but in Marvel Champions, you have a main scheme, and once enough yellow tokens go on it, you lose. And when they get put into play, they have something they kind of ask you to do sometimes, not all the time, but for example, Underground Distribution here on the left says, when revealed, discard cards from the encounter deck until a minion is discarded, put that minion into play, engage with the first player. Basically, you just start with a minion engage with you, you start with an enemy. In Arkham Horror, it's a lot more complicated. It's got an action on it that says you can spend clues to draw a card of a certain deck. It's got an objective of what you need to do that game. And I'm going to go on a limb here and say this act card, which is going to start that scenario in play in Arkham, from the core set, it's from the second scenario. The objective on here and what you need to do to win that scenario is more unique than any scenario in all 5 years of Marvel Champions. Because in Marvel Champions, 90% of scenarios, you just win by punching the villain, and it doesn't really go into kind of very specific objectives to win at all. And you might think, oh, Arkham sounds a lot more interesting. But Marvel Champions is very fluid, very smooth. You kind of know what you're doing as soon as you get into there. And the whole system is built around just beating the villain. And it works really well. You can kind of see the amount of text on the right hand card uh, outweighs the card on the left a lot. And the card on the left is kind of a one time thing, whereas on the right, it's kind of constantly what you're working towards. And in Arkham, there's also an agenda card, which goes next to the act card, which can have just as many words and just as much going on in it. So Arkham does a lot more, and you can get a lot more out of it, but there's also a lot more things to manage and keep in mind as well, which is kind of part of the trade-off. Now, both of these games are for 1 to 4 players. Arkham Horror, I don't know if I'd call it fully functional solo. I mean, it is, but with a small card collection, you're gonna have a harder time. And not every investigator is really designed, in my opinion, to work in solo play. Whereas in Marvel Champions, almost every character, with maybe 1 or 2 small exceptions, they can all work really well in solo play. We also need to focus back on those campaigns for Arkham, because if you do like campaigns, they are so much more fun in Arkham, in my opinion. Just the evolving story, the differences, of your choices and what kind of occurs, the way you can use experience to build up your deck and upgrade cards, bring new cards in. Your deck really evolves, and it's so much fun. But then with standalone scenarios, Marvel Champions is just way better in that regard. Whereas in Arkham Horror, if you just play one of its scenarios on its own, it kind of falls a bit flat without the context of the rest of a campaign and sort of a greater goal. Arkham Horror does have scenario packs like that Winter Gala pack I mentioned earlier that Chaos Cards provided. Definitely check out chaoscards.co.uk if you haven't already. Use my discount code VillainChaos. The scenario packs for Arkham are really good and kind of provide some of that Marvel Champions experience in Arkham Horror. Each of those scenario pack scenarios generally has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a cohesive story from the beginning to the end of that. You don't have to play through 8, you just play through 1. And I find that extremely enjoyable. Maybe it's just being a Marvel Champions player that I like the standalone sort of scenarios, but I think they are really fun in Arkham Horror. Murder at the Excelsior Hotel is also a very good one if you can get a hold of it. I really enjoy that. One of the things I want to talk about between both of these games is kind of the accessibility, the rules, and it's kind of an interesting discussion. Marvel Champions, I think, is easier to learn initially, but the more you play the game, the more rules questions comes up. You'll figure out that the rules are kind of like science. The more you know, the more questions you kind of have. Whereas in Arkham Horror, I feel like the rule book is a little bit tighter, a little bit easier to understand overall. Even if the overall systems are, there's more of them and a little bit more complex, a little bit more timing. So that's something to keep in mind. Overall, trying to compare them and like rank different things against each other for these games is really, really difficult because they're just such different games. Marvel Champions isn't trying to be as complex as Arkham Horror. It's going for, fluidity, a bit more streamlined, a bit more, throw down this villain and hero and let's duke it out, let's battle. Whereas Arkham Horror is a bit more involved. It's setting you up for an 8 scenario campaign typically. And it's got a map system, it's got an act and agenda, all these different objectives going on. If I had to rate the main characters that you play as in each card game, the heroes and investigators respectively, I think I would say the Marvel Champions ones are more replayable, but the Arkham Horror ones are slightly more unique. This kind of leads into the kind of aspect slash class talk, the sort of classes that you can build into. In Marvel Champions, 15 cards come with each hero that are only for that hero, not tied to the aspects. Other characters cannot deck build with them. That means a lot of the cards in Marvel Champions are only used by one character. Some of the coolest cards in the game just aren't available for anyone else to deck build with. Whereas in Arkham Horror, all the cards you're building with are pretty much in the deck building pool, so you can do some really crazy stuff, and it kind of has a lot more variety in my opinion. But it's also a lot harder. And with Marvel Champions, with every character coming with 15 of their own cards, they can do some really unique stuff that's, tied to that character. Whereas Arkham Horror's card design in terms of, what's going to be in your deck has to be a little bit more broader in terms of design that way. I think Marvel Champions, in terms of the heroes' replayability, all that kind of thing, having 15 of their own cards, I give the heroes a slight edge. But in Arkham Horror, I think I give the scenarios the slight edge in being more, kind of just more interesting, more variety, and all the different outcomes. Campaigns in Arkham Horror, definitely way, way better than Marvel Champions. It's not even close. The story's better, just the different outcomes, the twists and turns, just the whole experience system of evolving your deck, so good. Marvel Champions, but the Marvel Champions standalone experience is so good. Marvel Champions is a lot more modular on the villain side, whereas in Arkham Horror, you basically, you play the scenario once, and it's gonna, be set up the same way next time in a lot of cases. In Marvel Champions, you can change the modular sets out. What that means is that the set of cards that the villain uses, some of them are set in stone, but some of them can be changed out. So Green Goblin, that pack comes with the Goblin Glider modular set, so I can put Goblin Gliders on any kind of villain I want. I can have, the Brotherhood of Mutants, the X-Men's enemies, fighting alongside, I don't know, Thanos. You can mix things up like crazy, and no villain has to be the same twice. Arkham Horror doesn't really have that strength to it, but the scenarios do have a lot more innate depth and complexity, so it's really hard to make a straight comparison between these. But I would say Marvel Champions is just more replayable overall, whereas Arkham Horror, once you know the twists and turns of a scenario, it can take away a lot of the kind of the horror and tension element, even though the game still has a lot of that built in general. And really, I could keep talking, I could go into more depth, but I think that covers most of it. Marvel Champions is faster, more kind of explosive, more stuff is happening, you're cycling through your cards. Arkham Horror, you're more careful. You actually, I don't know if I mentioned this, you're limited to 3 actions each turn you have. So you have to very carefully think about how you're going to, use them, what you're going to choose, what you do. So Marvel Champions is kind of do as much as you can till you run out of resources. Arkham Horror just has all this depth, all this story, whereas Marvel Champions is just this kind of more faster paced mayhem. But both have a lot of deck building depth, both have a lot of gameplay depth, especially if you go looking for it. But both are really solid games and both are really fun. If I had to rate them overall and choose my favorite, it's very, very difficult. Now, I do run a specialist Marvel Champions channel. I do love Marvel Champions, and I think I have to pick Marvel Champions. But Arkham Horror does a lot better than Marvel Champions if I'm in the right mood. It is incredibly fun. Whenever I bust open a pack of Arkham Horror cards, I've got a new expansion, and I look at them, they are incredibly fun. They just have some incredible things going on the cards, and I'm thinking, wow, I wish Marvel Champions had this. I wish Marvel Champions had that. And yet Marvel Champions just ends up back on my table more often. It's just fun at its core. It's dynamic. The cards don't need to be as complicated because you're typically playing more of them every turn. So the parts of the game, suit the purpose of the game. And you really have to pick what calls to you, I think. But hopefully this has been a helpful, interesting look at it. And whatever you decide, I hope you check out chaoscards.co.uk. Use my discount code VillainChaos. Details in the description. And I'll see you guys in the next video.